Well, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, but Adam and the panel that was just on in particular, well done and congratulations for actually finishing ahead of time. I certainly appreciate that, and it means that I can perhaps talk a little longer. And we'll get to have a beer a bit sooner than we might have otherwise. But certainly I think today has been a very stimulating and challenging day with the issues that we've addressed during the Plumbing Supply Forum. And I want to again thank Jeff Patchell and Plumbing Connections for their efforts in making sure this day goes forward every second year, and also the great sponsors that we've had this year. And again, I'd like to just recognise them really quickly. Reliance, thank you very much for your support, and Jeff mentioned earlier today the longevity of your involvement with the Plumbing Supply Forum. Now, Pearl, thank you very much for your support. It's great to have you on board for the first time, and hopefully we'll see you again in this capacity. We know we'll see you out there in the marketplace, so it's great, thank you. Wells, Carol Grossman, thank you very much from the Department of Agriculture and Water for your support for the event today. It's been greatly appreciated. This is the work that you do with Wells in supporting the industry and the responsiveness your department shows to industry when we raise issues with you. We greatly appreciate that. And Corona, of course, well, Steve had to duck off. He had another meeting he had to get to, and I hope he's not battling traffic somewhere to get there, but I'm sure he is in Sydney. But thanks, Karama, and of course IATMO, Oceana, and Paul and his team's involvement in our industry, but also in supporting the Plumbing Supply Forum. So my role this evening is to give a bit of a wrap-up, and really, to give justice to the wrap-up, I'd probably be here for the next 3 hours. But we've had some great speakers, and I guess the two significant keynote speakers were Robert Merler, first up this morning, and followed by Professor Stuart White after lunch. And I'd just like to say that, you know, there was some fantastic insight that Robert Mellor provided in terms of the economy, the relative stability of the Australian economy at the moment in terms of where it could be, and that's also translated in terms of the broader global economy, that it's relatively stable in spite of the dysfunction in the politics. And I think that's not just an Australian situation, it's probably a global one too, as he suggested. But he also talked about the new dwelling growth being reasonably weak, new non-dwelling building quite strong, quite a strong growth period, similarly and a reduction in new engineering construction, and that the exchange rate's relatively steady, which also has an impact on terms of our economy. But I think it gave us some very good insights going forward about what the challenges are and how that works as far as the industry is concerned. Professor Stuart White, I think his presentation was very good, and it was great to have him speak, particularly given his long-term involvement in issues of sustainability and water efficiency. And he gave us quite a good vision, I think, in terms of future directions, and he also addressed the historic management issues in terms of the unmanaged water situation and the disease factors that occurred back in the 1850s and then took us through to the 21st century, and how we would manage those situations. He also talked about market disruption to some extent and compared the potential, if you like, of the electricity and energy supply side and how they've had problems and transportation, etc., is 50% of the total cost, and that we need to be very careful in terms of the water issues and how we as a community, and more than just specifically as an industry, but obviously the impacts on us as an industry, we go forward with that particular issue. So I think those two speakers, it was great to be able to have them attend and participate. But then we had some great panel presentations, and the panel presentations was somewhat of a new format generally, and I think it went very well from my observations and my participation with the non-conforming section chaired by Scott Michaels and and the involvement of Ivan Donaldson, Robert Munro and Bonnie Ryan. And I think just there was certainly some interesting challenges from Ivan Donaldson in terms of having to wait for catastrophic events before we actually get change, and a lack of leadership, and perhaps they weren't quite his words, but I think a lack of leadership from government agencies and politicians in addressing some of the regulatory needs that we as an industry think perhaps should be developed. And also Bonnie Ryan's discussion also I think was rather instructive in terms of using barcodes for information supply and how that could be used to monitor, if you like, product quality going forward into the future. And I think there's some great opportunities in that regard. And of course, Robert Munro spoke to us about what was happening in Queensland, and I think by and large, those of us who have had a look at it really support what's happening in Queensland, and they've taken a leadership position. It's just a shame that it's not been picked up as dramatically or as quickly in other states. And I'm not saying it's a perfect situation in Queensland, but at least it seems to have a forward direction that will be of value to industry going forward, ensuring that appropriate products are being used, that they're installed correctly, and that there's an ability for them to prosecute and an intent on their part to not only prosecute but police the regulatory arrangements they have in place. And we heard during the next panel session from Neil Savoury about the challenges going forward, particularly with point of sale for Watermark, and his assertion that the regulators, the state regulators, wouldn't be able to manage the cost impacts of a duplicate situation where there was point of sale and point of installation. Well, there's not too many states that I'm aware of that are actually spending any money on point of installation inspections. It might have happened 30 years ago when the water utilities actually managed the water and plumbing systems, but it certainly hasn't been happening in recent times. And I've actually read a statement from the Building Commission in Western Australia where they claim to have inspected all of the products installed in the Perth Children's Hospital to ensure that they were compliant. Well, the results of that and the fact that they've actually replaced many thousands of the brass fittings in the hospital would suggest that wasn't the case, or if they had inspected them, they might have looked at them and then walked on. I'm sorry, I get a bit carried away with some of these things. Then we had and then of course Bronwyn spoke about standards and where they are, and then in her presentation she spoke about the technical governance review and the report and some changes happening there. And by and large I think we welcome those changes and think they'll provide a positive outcome, and it emphasised perhaps greater community input, but it's about getting a balanced approach towards these things and getting productive outcomes, but more importantly making sure that there is a timely process to get change and amendment to standards and involvement with people in that process. And of course James Galloway was supporting the accreditation process and that of Watermark cabs and how it worked, and I think provided some interesting background to that area and provided support for the system. And I think that we can, as an industry group, we should always be working together to make sure that we get improvements in results that provide the best possible outcomes, because at the end of the day this whole process of certification and licensing, Watermark licensing, and that is all about ensuring that products are fit for purpose and protecting public health and safety. And public health and safety, of course, is the biggest driver, really, in what we do. The building information modelling, well, I think Adam touched on that with the contractors here a minute ago. I think it's certainly an interesting concept. I think it's going to be very challenging in a lot of areas going forward, but it's again the introduction of new technologies, new systems, new processes that will over time improve efficiencies and support for industry and consumers. Then we had Professor Stuart White, as I mentioned, I think a great presentation, and he's been involved in the water efficiency area for a long time. And then the skills training session and discussions about apprenticeships and cadetships, how that works going forward. And I think there are a lot of challenges in that area, and whatever methodology is adopted, the critical aspect is really to make sure that we have people in the industry that come through as plumbing tradesmen, licensed plumbers, and gravitate into other areas of industry that have the skills and the qualification to do the work. And there's plenty of challenges that are occurring from what apprentices probably did 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, on and off the job, to technological changes that are occurring now. We've only got to look at what's happening in terms of gas fitting, technological change and the impacts that's having on the industry. I remember years ago wanting to have introduced a training course for electronic tapware. It took about 3 years to get something in place. Well, in that 3 years in Western Australia, we had our own training centre in place to address the training needs of industry. So there's lots of challenges. Those challenges aren't going to go away, but we need people and leadership to make sure that we continue to focus on the challenges and the issues. And the challenges and the issues, lead-free brass. Where are we going with that? Well, the Plumbing Product Industry Group established a working group called Lead-Free Drinking Water under the chairmanship of Adam Degman and a number of our people on it. We've come up with a position paper that largely supports the position in the USA with 0.25%, and we're working forward with that. We're following discussions over the last couple of days. We're redeveloping and rewriting that discussion paper to provide greater clarity, and I think it was great that we had Peter Flynn give us quite a good detail about what the process was in the US, how long it took, and the transition period that was made available from the point of the legislation being introduced to the point where it impacted in the marketplace as far as industry was concerned, with a transition period. And I think that's critical in any environment or any marketplace, that there is an appropriate transition period to move stock and bring in new systems and provide manufacturers the opportunity to change, because there will be changes on manufacturers. If there is a change, I think there will be a change. I think that's the impact of that situation in the momentum is going to continue to build until there is change. And if there's changes in machining requirements, material supply requirements, those type of things, we need time to manage it. Then Paul gave a much more detailed background in terms of the experiences the IAPMO group had by being directly involved in the process in the US. And incidentally, it was good that Peter mentioned also the European situation, and that they're probably ultimately going to move in the same direction. And it won't be cost-free. There will obviously be some costs associated with that, and government and industry and the community have to understand and appreciate that. And I think ultimately the driver of this is public health and safety. And whilst there might be arguments about if we comply effectively with existing standards and that sort of stuff, the issue is relatively safe. We saw from Chris Galvin how he had a slide there at 0.01, and that the maximum allowable lead in drinking water is 0.01 milligrams, and then demonstrated examples across Perth in particular, but in other areas as well, where those water levels were considerably higher and impacted substantially. And the media's got hold of that and driven it quite well, and he showed a number of newspaper front page stories about it, and needs to review standards, particularly 5667.5, which is about testing water samples to get some consistency in those results and process, and at the moment it's not. The water sampling process can be different from one site to another, or one sample to another, which can give a substantially different result. So, and then we ended up with Adam in the trenches. It was good to get down there with you, Adam. and the panel that spoke there with him were Scott Dowsett, Evan Campbell and Rob Elliott, and we appreciate your contribution today. It's great, and I think that's been one of the values of today, is that we've had input across the broad industry sector. And thank you all very much, and I appreciate your time. And again, thanks to Jeff Patchell and his people from Plumbing Connections for their support in managing and conducting this forum. I think it's a great occasion, and thank you all. Please have a beer.